I drove 6 hours to walk my only daughter down the aisle, but when I arrived at the gate, I didn't find a welcoming committee. I found a security guard holding a laminated photo of my face with a thick red line drawn through it. Beneath my picture were 4 words that ended my fatherhood forever. Do not let in. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I simply turned my truck around and made one phone call. 4 hours later, the lights went out, and the music stopped, and my daughter realized that her perfect day had ended the moment she decided I wasn't good enough to be part of it. My name is Harold Drummond, though most folks in this town just call me Harold. At 72 years old, I've got hands that feel like coarse-grained sandpaper and a face that reads like a topographical map of every job site I ever ran. To anyone who passes me on the street, I'm just an old man behind the wheel of a 2000 Chevy Silverado that shakes when it hits 45 mph. To my daughter Claire, I am a source of shame, a blemish on the spotless image she has spent years building for herself. Welcome to alphadadstories. I'm glad you're here with me today. Before we get into it, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever had someone you loved shut you out after everything you did for them? Drop a yes or no down below. It only takes a second, and it means a lot to know who's listening. Now, a quick note: some elements of this story have been shaped for the audio format, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is purely coincidental. What matters is the truth at the center of it. It was a Saturday morning in June, the kind of day that seems purpose-built for weddings. The sky was a sharp, cloudless blue, the air already warm, and I was wearing the only tuxedo I owned. It was hanging in the bed of my truck, sealed in its dry-cleaning plastic, rocking with every bump on the road. I had bought it 20 years back for an awards banquet, and it still fit, though a touch snugger across the chest than it once had been. I had spent that morning buffing my work boots because I had no intention of squeezing my feet into those glossy patent leather shoes that cut off your circulation. A little black shoe polish I figured would take care of the scuffs well enough. I was headed toward Magnolia Bluff Resort. It is the kind of place where the grass looks like it gets trimmed by hand, and the fountain water runs some unnatural shade of turquoise. The most expensive venue in the state. It costs $50,000 just to open the front doors. My daughter Claire had told me the wedding was being funded by her fiancé Derek. She told me Derek was a tech entrepreneur, a visionary, a man who moved mountains with his mind. She told me his family was American royalty. She lied. I pulled off the main highway and onto the private drive lined with magnolia trees. My old truck chugged and sputtered, a dinosaur rolling into a world of Teslas and Mercedes. Up, I could see the valet stand staffed by young men in white jackets who looked like they had never once held a shovel. I felt a surge of pride swell inside my chest. Not over the luxury, but because my little girl was getting married. Whatever distance had opened up between us over the past few years, the unanswered calls, the short visits, I was still her father. I had a check for $50,000 sitting in my breast pocket. A wedding gift meant as a down payment on a house, or so I believed. I pulled up to the security checkpoint. It was no simple gate. It was a fortress of limestone and iron. A guard stepped out of the booth, a big man in a uniform that was a size too small, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. He didn't look at me. He looked at my truck. He looked at the rust creeping along the fender. He looked at the oil stain I was probably leaving on their spotless pavement. He raised one hand and palm forward, cutting me off before I could even reach the window crank. I rolled it down anyway. The air conditioning had given out 3 years ago, and sweat was already starting to bead on my neck. "Name!" the guard barked. Not a question. A command. "Harold Drummond," I said with a smile. "Father of the bride." The guard did not consult a list. He did not glance at a screen. He did not return the smile. Instead, he reached beneath the counter and came up with a clipboard. He lifted it level with my face. Clipped to it was a photograph. A picture of me taken from some distance, a cell phone zoom most likely. I was wearing my canvas work pants, standing on the porch of my cabin, holding a pipe wrench. It wasn't a flattering shot, but the photo itself wasn't what held my attention. It was the thick red marker line slashed across my face and the words printed in bold, furious letters across the bottom. Banned. Do not admit. If cited, call police immediately. I stared at the thing. My mind wouldn't take it in. It was like reading words in a language I didn't speak. There must be some mistake. I said, my voice level, though my hands had clamped down on the steering wheel hard enough to whiten my knuckles. I am Claire's father, Claire Drummond, the bride. No mistake, old man, the guard said. He leaned toward my window, and I caught the stale coffee on his breath. I have direct orders from Ms. Claire and Mr. Derrick. No construction workers, no hillbillies, and absolutely no one showing up in a wreck like that. You are ruining the aesthetic. The aesthetic. That was the word he chose. My presence, my very existence, was a flaw in the visual perfection of my daughter's wedding day. Turn around, he said, gesturing back toward the highway. And before you drip any more oil on my driveway, if you are not gone in 30 seconds, I'm radioing the sheriff. At your age, trust me, you do not want a night in a holding cell. I sat there, the engine idling with its rough, steady knock. I looked past the guard up the winding lane toward the main clubhouse. I could make out the white tents spread across the lawn. I could see the florists lugging massive arrangements of white hydrangeas. I could see the life I had financed, though no one up there knew it yet. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. I picked it up. A text from Claire. I opened it, hoping for an explanation, hoping it was all some terrible mix-up, and she was writing to ask where I was. The message was long, and it was cruel. Dad, please don't make a scene. I saw your truck turning onto the road. Please just go home. Derek's parents are here, and they are elite, sophisticated people. If they see you, if they see that truck, your rough hands, your cheap suit, it will destroy everything. You don't fit in this world, Dad. You never have. Please just let me have this one perfect day. I'll send you photos later. Just go. I read it twice, then a third time. She did not say she loved me. She did not say she was sorry. She said I would destroy everything. She said I didn't fit. I glanced at the guard. He was tapping his watch with a smug look on his face. He was enjoying every second of this, the power of turning away a man who clearly didn't belong. He thought he was the gatekeeper of paradise, shielding the beautiful people from the rest of us. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't say that I had poured the foundation this very guard booth was sitting on 20 years ago. I didn't mention that I knew the resort's owner by his first name. I simply nodded. Understood, I said. I put the truck in reverse, backed out slow and deliberate, turned the wheel tires grinding on the gravel. I drove back down the Magnolia Line drive, watching the white tents shrink away in my mirror. The ride home was quiet. I didn't reach for the radio. I needed the silence. I needed the space to absorb the fact that the little girl I had once carried on my shoulders, whose skinned knees I had bandaged, whom I had put through college working back-to-back shifts in freezing rain, had just cut me out of her life. I looked at my hands on the wheel. Rough, stained with a lifetime of oil and cement and paint. Claire was right about that much. These hands were not sophisticated. These hands built things. These hands fixed things. But today these hands had been turned away. My thoughts drifted back a week. The memory sat sharp and uncomfortable like a pebble in a boot. Claire had brought Derek out to meet me for the first time. An unannounced visit. I was at my cabin, a small wooden house on 3 acres down near the river. No mansion. A home. I had built it board by board after my wife Nadine passed away. It was my sanctuary. Derek had pulled up in a rented Jaguar. He climbed out in a suit that cost more than my truck. He looked over my cabin with a sneer he made no effort to conceal. "So, this is the shack," Derek said. No hello, no handshake. He simply surveyed my home and called it a shack. Claire laughed. A nervous, high-pitched sound. "I know," she said, taking his arm. I keep telling him to sell. The land is worth something, even if the house is a loss. We could use that money, Derek. Put it into your crypto project. Dad would finally be useful. I was standing right there. I was holding a tray of sweet tea I had just brewed for them. I heard every single word. Useful. That was all I was to them. An asset. A potential account balance wrapped up in old skin and worn denim. That day, I had swallowed every bit of my pride. I served them their tea. I sat and listened to Derek hold court about his tech company, his algorithms, his future billions. I listened to Claire agree with everything he said, watching him with eyes that couldn't see a single thing wrong. "Dad," Claire had said just before they left that afternoon about the wedding. "We're keeping it small. Close friends, really. It might be easier if you don't worry about making the trip. It's a long drive for someone your age." I had insisted. I told her I wouldn't miss it for anything in the world. I told her I had put money aside. I told her I wanted to be standing there. She had sighed. "Fine. But please, Dad, try to look presentable." Now, pulling away from Magnolia Bluff Resort, I understood that presentable was never the point. The point was invisibility. She wanted me gone. She wanted the money she thought she could get by selling my home out from under me. But she had no use for the man attached to it. I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out the check for $50,000, a cashier's check. Hard cash. I held it for a moment. Then I tore it in half. Then I tore those halves in half again. I cranked the window down and let the pieces catch the air. They scattered like confetti across the highway behind me. The sadness was gone. It had burned off the instant I saw that red line slashed across my photograph. What remained was something colder, something more deliberate. The clarity of a man who looks at a set of blueprints and sees that the whole structure is compromised. When a foundation has rotted through, you don't slap paint on it. You don't try to shore it up with patches. You bring it down. I picked up my phone again. I wasn't calling Claire. I wasn't going back to plead for entry. I scrolled through my contacts until I landed on the name I needed. Mr. Hartley. Hartley was my attorney, but he was more than that. He was the man who held my secrets. He was the one who managed the Drummond Trust. See, Claire and Derek had made a fatal miscalculation. They had judged me by my truck. They had judged me by my work clothes. They assumed that because I lived without fuss, I must have nothing. They assumed that because I kept to a cabin by the river, I must be poor. They didn't know I had walked away from construction 10 years ago when I sold my company for $8 million. They didn't know I held the deeds to 3 apartment complexes in the city. They didn't know I was the silent majority shareholder in the hospitality group that owned Magnolia Bluff Resort. I hit the call button. Hartley picked up on the second ring. "Harold, is everything all right? The ceremony ought to be underway by now." "It is not underway, Hartley," I said. My voice didn't waver. "I need you to pull the file on today's event at Magnolia Bluff Resort. The Claire Drummond and Derek Voss wedding." "I have it right in front of me," Hartley said. "You paid the invoice in full last month. $212,000 under the anonymous donor clause just as you instructed. Claire believes Derek's family covered it. Correction, I said. I want you to activate Clause 14C of the sponsorship agreement. There was a pause. I could hear him turning pages on his end. Clause 14C. Harold, are you certain? That is the immediate revocation clause. It grants the benefactor the right to withdraw funding on the spot if he is insulted, denied entry, or treated with contempt by the beneficiaries. That is the nuclear option. I am certain, I said. I was turned away at the gate. I was banned. They have a poster of my face pinned up at the security booth. Good God, Hartley breathed. His voice shifted from measured and professional to something harder. They did what? Shut it down, Hartley. I want you to ring the venue manager. I want you to ring the catering company. I want you to ring the florists. Tell them the card on file has been reported stolen. Tell them the funding is pulled. Tell them to stop everything right now. Harold, the ceremony is in progress. The guests are in their seats. If we move on this, it will be chaos. I know, I said. The road ahead stretched out flat and empty. Do it! And Hartley. Yes, Harold. Call resort management. Tell them I want access to the security camera feed. If I am not permitted to witness my daughter's wedding in person, then I intend to watch it from my iPad. Consider it done, Hartley said. I ended the call. I was 20 minutes from home. 20 minutes until I could pour myself a drink, lower myself into my favorite chair, and watch the whole house of cards come down. They had wanted a wedding without me. They were about to get precisely what they'd arranged for. But they had overlooked one thing. A wedding runs on money. And the bank of Dad had just shut its doors for good. I turned into the dirt driveway of my cabin. The sun was angling lower, dragging long shadows across the porch. It was quiet here. The river moved softly in the distance. Birds were going about their business. A sharp contrast to the storm I had just set loose. I walked inside without bothering with the lights. I went straight to the wall, safe behind the painting of the old mill. I worked the dial. Click, click, click. The heavy door swung open. Inside sat the deeds, the certificates, the paperwork of a life built through hard labor and careful choices. I pulled out the folder marked Claire. It held the trust fund documents I had drawn up in her name. A trust that would have paid her a monthly allowance for the rest of her life. A trust designed to make sure she would never lose sleep over bills, rent, or medical costs. I carried the folder to my desk. I slid open the drawer and took out the red stamp I used for rejected construction bids. Void. I brought it down on the first page, then the second, then the third. Each strike rang out in the stillness of the room. Thump, thump, thump. This wasn't rage. It was housekeeping. I was tidying up the mess. I went to the kitchen and poured a glass of bourbon. Not the kind of thing Derek would drink. The cheap stuff that burns on the way down. It tasted like truth. I settled into my leather armchair and opened up my iPad. I logged into the secure server for Magnolia Bluff Resort. Hartley had moved fast. The login credentials were already sitting in my inbox. I pulled up the camera feed for the grand ballroom. The image came to life on the screen. It was a stunning room. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls. Tables were laid with gold-rimmed plates and gleaming crystal glasses. Waiters threaded through the crowd carrying trays of champagne. I found Claire on screen. She was standing near the head table looking radiant, laughing, a glass of wine in one hand, the other resting on Derek's arm. She looked happy. She looked like a woman without a care. She believed the problem me had been neatly disposed of. I found Derek. He was holding court with a cluster of men, chest out, almost certainly pitching some imaginary venture. He looked like he owned the room. Beside them sat an older couple, a man in a tuxedo, a woman in a sequined gown. Distinguished looking, wealthy looking. These had to be the elite parents Claire had gone on about. I zoomed in. Something was off about them. They weren't watching Derek with any visible pride. They were checking their watches. They had the look of people fulfilling an obligation. People on the clock. I took a sip of bourbon. Then it happened. On the screen, the great crystal chandelier above the dance floor flickered. Once, twice, then died. The orchestral music that had been swelling softly through the room cut out in a shriek of feedback. The ballroom dropped into a gray, half-dark, lit only by the red glow of exit signs and the handful of candles on the tables. I watched heads turn. I watched the confusion ripple through the crowd like a wave. I watched Claire's smile disappear. She tapped at her microphone. Nothing. She looked around her face, tightening into something between bewilderment and fury. Then a man in a dark suit walked onto the stage. I recognized him immediately. It was Mr. Waverly, the general manager of the resort. He had no microphone, so he cupped his hands around his mouth. I turned the volume up on my iPad. The security microphones were sensitive enough to catch it. I could hear the crowd noise settle as Waverly began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," Waverly called out, his voice carrying across the sudden hush. "I must apologize for the interruption. We have just received notification that the funding for this event has been withdrawn. The credit line has been canceled by the account holder." I watched Claire drop her wine glass. It hit the dance floor and burst apart, red spreading across the white of her dress like an open wound. "This is a private facility." Waverly continued, his tone carrying no warmth at all. "Without confirmed payment, we cannot continue services. The kitchen is closed. The bar is closed. We are asking all guests to vacate the premises within 15 minutes. The room erupted. Claire flew at Waverly. I could hear her screaming, her voice gone shrill and desperate. "What are you talking about? My husband paid for this. Run the card again." Waverly raised a tablet. He turned the screen toward her. "The payment was made by the Drummond Trust, ma'am. The authorization originated with Mr. Harold Drummond. He has reported the transaction as unauthorized use of funds and issued a stop payment order." I watched Claire's face. The color left it so rapidly, she looked like she had turned to chalk. "My father," she whispered. The security microphones caught every word of it. "My father doesn't have any money. He lives in a shack." "I wouldn't know about that, ma'am," Waverly said, stepping back to keep her hands off him. "What I do know is that the Drummond Trust holds a significant ownership stake in this resort, and Mr. Drummond's word is final here. You have 14 minutes. I took another sip of bourbon. The burn felt right. This was only the opening's act. The lights were out, but the real performance hadn't even begun. Claire was about to find out what happens when you bar the man who laid the foundation. The whole structure comes down with him. I stepped into the cabin and let the heavy oak door swing shut behind me. The silence hit at once, clean and total. I left the light switch alone. I didn't need to see the worn rug or the scuffed paint to know where I was. I had laid every plank of this floor myself 40 years ago. My eyes found their footing in the dark moonlight, pressing through the dusty blinds and throwing long, bar-like shadows across the room. To anyone passing by outside, this was just the dim living room of a lonely widower with nothing left but old memories. They had it wrong. I moved through the shadows to the study at the back of the house. On the far wall hung a painting, a simple watercolor of the lake, that my wife Nadine had finished 3 months before she passed. I eased it aside carefully, my fingers reading the frame from long habit and grief. Behind it sat a Titan steel safe bolted directly into the load-bearing studs of the wall. cold to the touch. I spun the dial left to 24 right to 10 left to 72. The numbers were the date I laid the first brick of my first company. The tumblers seated themselves with a sound like a weapon being cocked. I pulled the heavy handle down. The door opened and the room filled with the smell of old paper and cool steel. No stacks of cash inside. No gold bars. Something far more dangerous than either: information. I drew out a leather-bound portfolio and set it on the desk. I clicked on the small brass lamp. The yellow pool of light fell across the documents that Claire had been so certain did not exist. The first was a deed not for this cabin, but for the Ridgeline Terrace apartment complex downtown. 300 units fully occupied, not a dollar of debt against them. I turned the page. A majority shareholder certificate for Drummond Construction Holdings, the company I had supposedly sold off for scraps, but which I had actually converted into a passive income engine, turning out $40,000 a month in dividends alone. My daughter had believed I was getting by on a pension and Social Security. She figured the reason I drove a 20-year-old truck was that I couldn't stretch to a car payment. She never grasped that real wealth doesn't announce itself. Wealth is quiet. Wealth is the freedom to not lose a moment's sleep over what a security guard thinks of your boots. Then I reached for the blue folder, the one that was relevant tonight. I opened it. On top sat the invoice for the Magnolia Bluff Resort wedding package. $212,000 paid in full by wire transfer 3 months prior. At the foot of the page was a signature line. It did not read Derek Voss. It did not read the Voss family. It was signed Harold Drummond. And beside it sat the addendum I had insisted upon before I wrote a single cent. The privacy clause. It specified that the identity of the funding source would remain undisclosed to the bride and groom unless a breach of contract took place. I pressed my thumb across the signature. Claire had called me in tears months back, saying Derek's money was tied up in overseas investments and they needed a deposit to hold the date. She had not been telling the truth. Derek's funds weren't tied up anywhere. He was flat broke. I knew this because I had run a credit check on him the day they got engaged. I had paid for this wedding not out of naivety, but because I wanted my daughter to have the celebration she had always dreamed of, even if the man she was marrying was a nightmare. I had shielded her from humiliation. I had covered her fiancé's lies with my own name and money. I had literally paved the ground she was walking on today. And her way of thanking me was a photograph of my face pinned at the security gate, stamped with the message that I was unwanted. I reached back into the safe and brought out one final document. A commercial lease agreement. The master lease on the land Magnolia Bluff Resort occupied. I had purchased that acreage 30 years ago when it was nothing but swamp grass and timber. I had leased it to the resort management company on a 99-year term. I wasn't just the man who had bankrolled the party. I was the landlord of the very ground Claire was standing on right now. Technically, I had the power to evict the entire resort, though that would have meant months of court proceedings, and I had no need for it. I only needed to stop the music. I looked at the papers fanned out beneath the lamp. They were the record of a life spent building, accumulating, and protecting. A legacy I had assembled for Claire, and tonight she had thrown out the builder while expecting to keep everything he had built. I looked again at the clause. Clause 14C, breach of conduct. It entitled the benefactor to terminate the event on the spot if the venue or the beneficiaries acted in a manner that dishonored the donor. Banning the man who had signed the check was about as clear a dishonor as you could get. In that room, I was no longer just some old man behind the wheel of a battered truck. Under that lamp, I was the institution. I was the bank. I was the one in the corner office, and I was calling in a debt no one had the means to settle. I closed the folder. The sound was definitive. like a gavel finding the block. It was time to make the call. I reached into the bottom drawer of my desk, past the old blueprints and the yellowed tax returns from 1998, and my hand closed around a thick manila envelope that had arrived at my door 3 days earlier by private courier. No return address, just a red stamp that read "Confidential." I had left it sealed until now. Part of me, the part that was still just a father who wanted to walk his daughter down the aisle, had wanted to hold on to the story she had told me. I had wanted to believe that Derek really was the tech visionary she kept describing. I had wanted to believe she had found someone who could take care of her the way I always had. But the builder in me, the man who knows you never pour a foundation until you've tested the ground beneath it, had known better all along. I had retained Keating, the finest private investigator in the state, a month ago, once Claire started asking me for substantial sums of cash to fund investment opportunities Derek had identified. I pulled the tab on the envelope. The paper tore with a sharp, clean sound in the quiet room. I slid the contents out beside the resort deed, a dossier, a thick sheaf of pages clipped together, carrying that smell of fresh toner and unforgiving fact. The first page was a summary, a background check on one Derek Alexander Voss. I ran my eye over the basics: date of birth, social security number, last known address. It was not the penthouse apartment Claire had boasted about to anyone who would listen. It was a sublet in a transient pocket of the city near the airport. Then I reached the employment history. Claire had told me Derek was the CEO of a company called Nebula Systems. She said they were upending the blockchain. She had used words like synergy and disruption, the kind of words that mean everything and nothing. I looked at what Keating had found. He was thorough. Occupation: unemployed. Prior employment: shift supervisor at a car rental agency, terminated for cause. Sales associate at a cell phone kiosk, quit after 3 months. There was no Nebula Systems. There was no tech empire. There was a website registered on a free hosting platform 3 months ago, stocked with stock photos of people shaking hands in glass-walled conference rooms. The CEO headshot wasn't even Derek. It was a model pulled from a stock image library. I turned the page and felt a cold knot settle in my gut. The financial section. This is where the fairy tale curdled into something far darker. Derek did not have millions. He had debt. Massive, crushing, inescapable debt. The report listed judgments from 3 separate credit card companies adding up to over $80,000. But that was the clean debt, the kind you can address in bankruptcy court. The next page laid out the dirty debt. Keating had gone deep. He had surfaced the gambling records, Tunica online sports betting operations out of the Caribbean underground poker rooms in the city. Derek was a gambler, and a losing one at that. Total estimated liabilities to unlicensed lenders: $540,000. I sat with that number. $500,000. This wasn't a man who was bad with money. This was a man with a target on his back. And then it landed on me, cold and absolute, exactly what this wedding was. It was not a celebration of love. It was a fundraising event. Derek wasn't marrying my daughter because he loved her. He was marrying her because he needed the cash gifts. He needed access to her credit score, still spotless from years of my guidance. He needed a wife who could serve as a buffer between him and the kind of men who collect debts with their fists. I flipped through the photographs clipped to the file, grainy surveillance shots of Derek arguing with men in leather jackets outside a pool hall. Photos of him pawning a Rolex watch. Photos of him behind the wheel of a rented Lamborghini, the same one he'd driven to my house to look down his nose at me, then returning it barely an hour later to dodge the extra mileage fees. He was a hollow man. Ego and desperation dressed up in a thin coat of arrogance. And my daughter, my sharp, ambitious Claire, had swallowed the whole performance hook, line, and sinker. She had looked at his rented suit and his leased car and seen royalty. She had looked at my paid-off truck and my paid-off land and seen someone beneath her. A wave of rage hit me so hard my vision went soft at the edges. I wanted to put my foot through the resort doors, find him on the dance floor, and drag him out by his collar for everyone to see. But then I turned to the section marked the parents. That was where it twisted the knife. That was the part that cooled my rage into something colder than anger. Claire had been so deliberate about Derek's family. She had described them as old money, the kind of people who spend summers at Kiowa Island and winters in Lake Placid. Sophisticated, she'd said. Cultured. The kind of people who wouldn't know what to make of a man like me. That was her excuse for the sign at the gate. She was shielding their refined sensibilities from the embarrassment of her blue-collar father. I studied the dossier. Keating had identified the couple seated at the head table at this very moment. The man was no oil tycoon. His name was Clem. He was a retired high school drama teacher who picked up work doing local commercials for car dealerships. I placed him now, the guy who hollered about low financing rates on the local cable channel at 2 in the morning. The woman was no socialite. Her name was Dottie. She was a former hostess who supplemented her income through a casting agency for distinguished seniors. Booking rate $200 an hour plus meals. I leaned back, the leather of the chair creaking under me. The quiet of the cabin pressed in on my ears like something physical. My daughter had turned her back on her real father, the man who sat beside her when she needed stitches, the man who'd written the check for her braces, the man who'd taught her to ride a bike pushed aside to make room for 2 performers hired out of a catalog. She had traded flesh and blood for props. She was ashamed of me, ashamed of the sawdust on my clothes and the calluses carved into my hands. She wanted the fantasy so badly, she was willing to cut out the only real thing in her life to get there. The rage I'd been carrying began to drain away, leaving something wide and hollow in its place, a cold, clinical pity. I looked at the photo of Claire tucked into the file. She was beaming in the picture, completely blind to the shark treading water beside her. She believed she'd hit the jackpot. She thought she was stepping up into a different class of life. She was stepping into a trap. Derek was going to bleed her dry. Every dollar I had set aside for her over the years, he was going to take it. He was going to wreck her credit, her mortgage, her future, and leave her holding nothing but debt and regret. If I stormed in there and stopped the wedding by force, she would despise me for it. She'd say I was jealous. She'd say I was trying to tear down her happiness. She wouldn't believe the dossier. She'd call it a forgery. She was too far inside the delusion to see daylight. I understood then that I couldn't shield her from the fall. I could only decide when to pull away this net. She had called me a simple man. She had mocked my intelligence. She thought she had the sharper mind because she worked in marketing and I worked in dirt. But she couldn't spot a con man standing 3 feet in front of her face. I picked up the photo of the hired parents again. Clem and Dottie. Right now, they were probably working through the lobster thermidor I had paid for, drinking the vintage champagne I had approved, playing their parts, flawlessly smiling, nodding, stealing glances at their watches, counting the minutes until they could collect their checks and head home. And Claire was glowing in their direction, hungry for their approval, desperate to be welcomed into a family that had never existed. It was pathetic. The most heartbreaking thing I had ever witnessed. My eyes dropped to the bottom of the dossier where Keating had stapled a printout of Derek's text messages. He had managed to clone Derek's phone for a brief window. The texts were from yesterday, Derek to a contact saved as Bruno. Don't worry about the payment. The wedding is tomorrow. The old man gave her a fat check plus the cash gifts. I'll have your $50K by Monday. Just call off the dogs. From Claire to Derek, I handled my dad. He won't be coming. I told security to keep him out. I don't want him embarrassing your parents. From Derek to Claire. Good girl. We don't need that trash around us. We are building an empire, babe. Trash. That is what he called me, and she had agreed. Good girl. He spoke to her like she was an animal he'd trained to bite the hand that had raised her. I closed the dossier. The pity hardened into something firm and purposeful. I was no longer simply a father who'd been turned away at the gate. I was the judge. And the verdict was guilty. She wanted to live in a fantasy, fine. I would let the fantasy run its course until the lights went out. I would let her stand in the dark with her counterfeit husband and her hired in-laws. I would let her feel the cold weight of the world she had chosen. I wasn't doing this out of cruelty. I was doing it because it was the only lesson that would ever reach her. You cannot build a life on lies. You cannot build a future on debt. And you cannot build anything worth having by throwing away the people who genuinely love you. I looked at the phone on my desk. It was time to call Hartley, time to cut the power, time to show Claire exactly what her empire was worth the moment the Bank of Dad closed its doors. I reached for the receiver. My hand was steady. The urge to cry was gone. What I felt now was the urge to work. And tonight, the work was demolition. I was going to bring the whole house down brick by fake brick. I lifted the receiver of the landline on my desk. Old, heavy black, the kind of phone that sits in your hand like something solid and purposeful. I dialed Leonard Hartley's private mobile number from memory. I hadn't needed to look it up in 2 decades, not since he'd helped me fight through the zoning battles that made it possible to build the very resort where my daughter was at this moment celebrating my absence. The line rang once, twice, then a click. Harold Hartley's voice came through crisp and measured, though under it I caught the faint hum of background noise. He was almost certainly in his home office, monitoring things, waiting to see which way I'd move. He knew me too well to believe I'd simply driven off into the night. "It is time, Leonard," I said. My voice didn't shake. It didn't bend. It came out the same way it used to when I called a foreman to tear down a frame job that wasn't built to code. Flat, final, a pause on the other end. Long, heavy. "You want to execute Clause 14C?" Hartley asked. No surprise in his voice, only resignation. He was a good lawyer. He understood that when a contract is broken, the remedy has to follow. "Execute it," I confirmed. "But pulling the funding isn't enough. I want a complete facility lockout. We're moving beyond a sponsorship withdrawal into a full hostile shutdown." I leaned forward and rested my elbows on the dossier of Derek's lies. "Walk me through the kill switch, Leonard. I want to know exactly what happens next." Hartley cleared his throat. I heard the rustle of papers on his end. "All right, Harold. I have the master control agreement for Magnolia Bluff Resort open in front of me. As majority shareholder of the holding company, you hold executive override across all facility operations. Step 1 is financial severance. I'm logging into the merchant portal now." I waited. I took a sip of bourbon, the cheap stuff that burns on the way down. Done. Hartley reported that the master account tied to the event had been frozen. The credit limit was zeroed out. Any further charges the venue staff might attempt, overtime, drinks, incidentals, whatever, would be declined on the spot. The open bar tab was now a dead end. "Good," I said. "Now the infrastructure. I want the room dead, Leonard. I am reaching the facility manager, Clint, on the other line." Hartley's voice carried the sound of keystrokes as he spoke. "I am issuing a code red override. This directs the engineering team to isolate the power grid for the grand ballroom. We are leaving the emergency lights on. We don't need a lawsuit over injuries, but the main stage power, the audiovisual circuits, and the atmospheric lighting are going dark." "How long?" I asked. 90 seconds, Hartley replied. "Clint is standing at the breaker panel right now. He is waiting on my confirmation code." "Give it to him," I said. And the sound system runs on a separate loop, Hartley explained. We are remotely pulling the digital license for the DJ's console. His interface is going to lock up solid. The microphones will go mute. The speakers will cut out. Silence, Harold. Absolute silence. And the food I asked. I paid $50,000 for a 5-course meal. I don't want Derek or his counterfeit parents getting a single bite of the entree. The catering manager is receiving the call now. Hartley said the order is to halt service immediately. The waitstaff is being instructed to clear the tables. Whatever hasn't been plated stays locked in the warming ovens. Anything already on the table gets pulled. The contract is clear once funding is canceled. All unconsumed inventory reverts to the vendor. They are not going to feed a party that isn't paying. I studied the screen of my iPad. The party was still going full tilt. Claire was laughing. Derek was pouring champagne. They looked so assured, so untouchable. One more thing, Leonard, I said. The honeymoon suite, the presidential villa. Ah, Hartley said, the crown jewel of the resort. Lock it down, I ordered. I want their key cards deactivated. I want the reservation scrubbed from the system. I want security to flag their names. If they try to go up there tonight to hide, to sleep, to consummate this charade of a marriage, I want the red light flashing on that door. I want them standing in the hallway with their bags, realizing they have nowhere left to go. It is done, Harold Hartley said quietly. I just pushed the command to the central server. The keys are plastic scrap. The room has been returned to inventory. I drew a slow breath. There was something strange about wielding this kind of invisible power. I wasn't raising my voice. I wasn't making a scene. I was sitting alone in a dark cabin miles away, flipping switches that would dismantle my daughter's world. It felt like surgery, necessary, painful, and precise. Hartley spoke again, a brief crack in his professional composure. Are you sure once I give Clint the final go-ahead on the power, there is no unringing this bell? The humiliation will be public. It will be total. I looked at the photo of me on the clipboard the guard had held up to the camera. Banned. Do not let in. They wanted me gone, Leonard. They wanted to erase me. I am simply giving them exactly what they asked for, a wedding completely free of my involvement. Which means a wedding free of my money, my property, and my protection. I understand, Hartley said. Executing sequence now. I heard the rapid clatter of his keyboard. Financials terminated. He called them out one by one. Catering stop order issued. Security alerted to remove unauthorized guests once the contract is voided, and power cut initiated. I watched the screen. It's happening. Hartley said, Goodbye, Harold. Call me if you need bail money, though I suspect Derek is the one who will need it. I set down the phone. I stared at the iPad. The feed lag was only a few seconds. I watched the exact moment the order hit the system. I saw the chandeliers flicker. I saw the lights die. I saw the darkness swallow the room whole, leaving only terrified faces lit by the guttering candles. It was done. The builder had yanked the cornerstone. All that was left was to watch the collapse. I poured another 2 fingers of bourbon into my glass and leaned in toward the iPad screen. Camera 4 gave a wide panoramic sweep of the grand ballroom, a high-angle shot that made the guests look like chess pieces on a very expensive board. The scene was one of total manufactured perfection. The floral centerpieces were towering arrangements of white peonies and gardenias costing $300 a table. The linens were crushed velvet in a shade of champagne that Claire had declared non-negotiable for the ambiance. Light from the crystal chandeliers fractured across the room, casting a shimmering golden haze that softened everything at the edges. It was beautiful. It was expensive. And it was entirely fraudulent. I zoomed in on the head table. Derek was on his feet, gripping a flute of Dom Perignon. Even through a digital feed, I could make out the sheen of sweat across his forehead. He was in his element, or rather the element he worked so hard to pretend he belonged to. His tuxedo fit a little too perfectly, likely tailored within an inch of its life, to conceal the fact that he was a man buckling beneath $500,000 in debt. His free hand swept wide as he worked the group of men at the next table. These were not friends. I recognized one of them, the local Lexus dealer. Derek wasn't celebrating a marriage. He was networking. He was pitching. I turned the volume up on the iPad. The ambient noise of clinking silverware and measured laughter filled the quiet of the cabin. Snippets of Derek's voice cut through the murmur, loud and brash. Blockchain integration, he was saying, jabbing the air with his fist. We are talking about a paradigm shift in how assets get liquidated. Nebulous Systems isn't just a company, gentlemen. It is a movement. You get in on the ground floor today, and in 6 months you are staring at a 10x return. Conservative estimate. He tipped back his champagne, not sipping it like a man at ease, but gulping it like a man who needed the nerve. He looked manic. His eyes swept the room, checking exits, reading faces, hunting perhaps for the debt collectors he knew were circling. But to everyone in that room, he was the portrait of young, hungry success. He was selling the dream, and they were buying it, because the venue was so opulent, the wine was so fine, and the lie was so pretty. Then the camera drifted left, and I found Claire. My heart didn't break, it had already broken at the gate. Now it simply felt heavy, like a stone settling into mud. She looked radiant. Her dress was a Monique Lhuillier custom-designed silk and lace that cost more than my first car. Her hand rested on the table. The diamond ring Derek had charged on credit, likely secured against her own social security number, without her knowledge catching the light. She wasn't looking at Derek with love. She was looking at him with triumph. Her eyes swept the room, drinking in the envy of her bridesmaids, the approval of the guests, the sheer scale of the evening. She was wearing the smile of someone who believes they have pulled off the heist of a lifetime. She had successfully outrun her past. She had scrubbed away the blue-collar stain of where she came from. No rough hands here, no old trucks, no fathers in canvas work pants, just gold crystal and the illusion of old money. She turned to the woman beside her, Dottie, the actress on retainer at $200 an hour. Claire leaned close and whispered something, a soft laugh escaping her lips. Dottie laughed back, a polished, hollow sound, and patted Claire's hand. It was a performance nested inside another performance. Claire was hungry for this woman's approval, desperate to be received by a counterfeit matriarch, standing in for a dynasty that didn't exist. She was basking under the attention of a stranger she believed was her mother-in-law. It was excruciating to watch. It was like seeing a child play house in a building that was already burning. I watched as a waiter approached the head table carrying a silver tray. He set a plate of filet mignon down in front of Derek. I knew that cut. It was dry-aged prime ribeye, $90 a pound. I had signed off on the invoice myself. Derek took up his knife and fork and sawed into the meat with the aggression that gave away every nerve in his body. He ate fast, almost frantically, as though he feared someone would snatch the plate before he could finish. Claire took a careful, delicate bite of her lobster. She scanned the room again, her gaze settling for a moment on the empty chair near the back, the seat where I should have been. She didn't look sad. She looked relieved. She raised her glass in a quiet, private toast to herself. She had done it. She had curated her life down to perfection. I checked the timestamp on the security feed. It was 7:42 p.m. Hartley had said the kill switch would execute in 90 seconds. That was 2 minutes ago. The feed delay meant it was unfolding right now. On the screen, Derek got back to his feet. He tapped his glass with a spoon. The sharp ringing cut through the iPad speakers. The room settled. He straightened his bow tie and puffed out his chest. He looked like a rooster crowing from the top of a debt pile. "I want to propose a toast," Derek announced, his voice filling the room. "To the future, to building empires, and to family, the kind of family that rises to meet our ambition." Claire beamed. She gazed up at him, eyes glistening with tears of joy. She genuinely believed she had won. She believed this moment was the opening act of her golden era. I took a pull of my cheap bourbon and let it settle. "Enjoy the toast, Derek," I whispered to the empty room. "Because you are about to learn that empires built on other people's money have a nasty habit of collapsing when the rent comes due." On the screen, the massive crystal chandelier above their heads gave a sudden violent flicker. It wasn't a soft dimming. It was a spasm. The light surged bright for a fraction of a second, bleaching the greed and fear on Derek's face in harsh white clarity, and then everything went black. The darkness wasn't simply an absence of light. It landed on that room like a physical weight dropping from a great height. For 3 seconds, absolute silence. No breath, no movement, just the shock of a world that had switched off without warning. Then the screaming began. It wasn't the scream of people facing mortal danger. It was the scream of entitlement being refused. It was the sound of 200 people discovering their comfort had been taken from them without so much as a warning. I watched on the iPad as the infrared night vision engaged on the security cameras, rendering the scene in ghostly greenish monochrome. Derek was still standing with his glass raised, frozen like a monument. He tapped the microphone. Thump, thump, nothing. The feedback loop was dead. The voice that had been booming about empires and blockchain moments ago was now just a small, meaningless sound inside a very large, very dark room. Then the emergency lights came on. They were not the warm, golden sconces of the ballroom. They were harsh, industrial halogen beams bolted above the exit doors. They threw long, jagged shadows across the tables, twisting the floral arrangements into strange, looming shapes and draining the color from every face in the room. The fairy tale illusion had evaporated. What remained was a warehouse full of bewildered people in expensive clothes. The service doors swung open. A phalanx of waitstaff marched through. They weren't carrying trays. They were pushing bus tubs. They moved with military precision, following the stop order Hartley had sent down. They hit the tables immediately. I watched one waiter lift a wine bottle from a table before the guest beside it could pour a second glass. Another slid a plate of untouched appetizers out from under a bridesmaid's hand without breaking stride. The murmur in the crowd swelled into a roar of indignation. What is going on? Where is the power? Why are they clearing the food? Then the man I had been waiting for made his entrance. Mr. Waverly, the general manager, walked to the center of the dance floor. He had no need of a microphone. His voice could cut through concrete without assistance. He held a tablet in one hand and a megaphone in the other, though he hadn't raised it yet. He looked directly up at the head table, straight at Derek and Claire. "Ladies and gentlemen," Waverly called out. The room quieted, not from respect, but from sheer confusion. "May I have your attention, please? This event has been terminated, effective immediately." Claire was on her feet so fast her chair toppled backward with a sharp crack against the floor. She moved through the gloom, her white dress washed to gray under the emergency lighting. She rushed to the edge of the stage and looked down at Waverly with fury and disbelief fighting for control of her face. "Terminated!" she shrieked. Her voice broke on the word. "Are you out of your mind? Do you have any idea who we are? My husband paid for this entire evening. You will restore the lights this instant, or I will sue you for everything you own." Waverly didn't flinch. He didn't offer a single word of apology. He regarded her with the weary patience of a man who has handled tantrums his entire career and has finally for once been handed the authority to end one. "Mrs. Voss?" Waverly said, his voice carrying cleanly to the back of the room. "Your husband did not pay for this event. The invoice for the Magnolia Bluff Grand Package totaling $212,000 was settled by the Drummond Trust." A ripple moved through the crowd. Heads turned. Whispers spread through the tables. "Drummond isn't that her maiden name?" Claire went still. "The Drummond Trust, that's my father, but that's not possible. He doesn't have that kind of money. He's a construction worker." "I cannot speak to your father's profession, ma'am," Waverly said, glancing at his tablet. "What I can tell you is that Harold Drummond is the account holder. And 10 minutes ago, Mr. Drummond issued a formal stop payment order on all funds tied to this event, citing a breach of contract." "Breach of contract," Claire stammered. She looked back at Derek, who had sunk into his chair with his face buried in his hands. "What breach?" Waverly looked up at her, and even through the grainy camera feed, I could read the cold satisfaction on his face. "Clause 14C," Waverly announced to the room. "The donor reserves the right to withdraw all funding if they are denied access to the event or treated with indignity. Gate Security filed a report that Mr. Drummond was refused entry to these premises on your direct orders. He was turned away at the gate." The room gasped, a collective intake of breath that seemed to pull the air right out of the ballroom. Guests turned to one another. The whispers sharpened and grew louder. She barred her own father, the man who bankrolled all of this. Didn't she say her husband was a crypto millionaire? Claire looked around, her eyes wide and frantic. She was losing the narrative. The story she had been crafting for years, the self-made woman marrying the tech visionary, was coming apart in real time. "That's a lie," she screamed, stabbing a trembling finger toward Waverly. "My dad is a broke old man. He lives in a shack. He couldn't cover a cup of coffee, let alone a wedding like this." "Derek paid Derek, tell them." She turned to Derek. She grabbed his shoulder and shook it. "Derek, tell him, show him the receipt. Show him the bank transfer." Derek looked up. His face was pale and slick with sweat. He had the look of a cornered animal. He didn't look at Claire. His eyes went straight to the exit signs. "Derek," Claire whispered. The head table microphone had been cut, but the ambient mics caught her perfectly. "Why aren't you saying anything?" Derek rose slowly from his chair. He reached for his jacket lapels, but his hands were trembling so badly he couldn't set them straight. "There was a mix-up with the bank," Derek mumbled. "It was weak. It was pathetic. My funds are held overseas. The transfer must have bounced. I asked your dad to cover the deposit just as a precaution." The deposit. Waverly let out a short, dry laugh. "Mr. Voss, the Drummond Trust paid the full balance 3 months ago. You haven't contributed a single dime. In fact, the credit card you placed on file for incidentals was declined an hour ago for a $10 charge at the lobby bar. The humiliation was complete. It was total. 200 people watched the golden boy disintegrate where he stood. The man who had declared himself an empire builder couldn't settle a bar tab." Waverly raised the megaphone. He wasn't addressing Claire anymore. He was speaking to the room. "The kitchen is closed," Waverly announced, his amplified voice bouncing off the walls like a pronouncement of judgment. "The bar's closed. Security is in the process of dismissing the valet staff from the premises. If you need your vehicle, collect your keys from the front desk at once. You have 10 minutes to vacate the property before we secure the main gates." The panic was immediate. Not the panic of genuine danger. The panic of inconvenience, pure and sharp. The elite guests, the very people Claire had spent years trying to impress, did not circle the wagons around her. They did not offer comfort. They scattered. I watched women in $5,000 gowns push past one another to reach the doors. I watched men in tuxedos barking into their phones, demanding their drivers appear. The waitstaff worked on relentless and unhurried. They pulled tablecloths off tables while guests were still standing at them. The crash of silverware dropping into bus bins was the soundtrack scoring the exodus. Claire stood alone on the stage. Derek had dissolved into the crowd and slipped away like a thief working the dark. She looked out at the stripped tables. She looked at the half-eaten food being carted off. She took in the darkness that closed around her on every side. What's coming next changed everything, and it cost more than I ever expected it to. Before we get there, let me ask you something. If you discovered that someone close to you had been living a complete lie, would you confront them in the moment? Or would you wait and let the truth do the work on its own? That face. It was the same face that used to crumple in the candy aisle when I told her no. The same little girl, decades older, coming apart in public. This time I wasn't crossing the room to comfort her. I wasn't going to soften any of this. I raised my bourbon and drank. It had gone warm. Didn't bother me one bit. The curtain hadn't dropped yet. Rats were scrambling over the rails, but the wreck was still in motion. From the head table, I watched Clem and Dottie, the hired help, the counterfeit parents, push back their chairs and rise. No panic on their faces. Just mild irritation, the look of people whose shift had run long enough. Clem glanced at his watch. Dottie reached for her bag. They made their way across the room toward Claire, who was staring at nothing somewhere between here and gone. I reached for the volume. Not a word of this was getting past me. "Hey, honey," Clem said, nudging Claire's arm. "Look, the drama isn't our concern, but the contract's clear. We collect at event's end or 9:00 p.m., whichever lands first. It's 8 o'clock and the event is technically over." Claire turned toward him, eyes slow to focus. "What's the fee?" Dottie cut in, voice stripped of warmth. $200 an hour, 4 hours on site plus the travel stipend. You're looking at $1,000, cash or Venmo, Claire blinked. "Who are you people?" "I'm Clem. This is Dottie," the man said. "We're the talent. Derek booked us through Gigmasters to portray his parents. So are you settling up, or do we open a dispute through the platform?" Claire's legs buckled. She dropped hard onto the lip of the stage, that costly dress splaying around her like a parachute that never caught air. "Actors," she breathed. "You're actors. Paid professionals," Dottie snapped. "And professionals collect what they're owed. Where has Derek gone?" "He left," Claire said. Nothing behind her voice at all hollow emptied out. "He ran." Miles away in my cabin, I sat watching the feed as the full bill came due on her choices. There she stood, no husband, no father, wearing borrowed finery inside a fraud she'd constructed herself. It was the most expensive education I'd ever given that girl. And the semester was far from over. On my screen, I watched the woman Claire had taken for her mother-in-law snap her purse open. With a quick, business-like motion, nothing of the languid, aristocratic composure she'd been selling all evening. Dottie, $200 an hour, was done with the role. She reached into her clutch, drew out a cigarette, and sparked it up right there at the head table. The lighter's flame threw a small orange glow across the dimness, a defiant little flare against the sudden bleakness that had settled over the room. A coil of smoke rose toward the dark chandelier overhead. In a venue that built its whole identity around exclusivity, it was the most brazen breach imaginable. But Dottie had already clocked out of caring. She pulled a long drag, exhaled a gray cloud directly into a bridesmaid's stunned face, and turned her full attention to my daughter. Claire was still folded at the edge of the stage, that dress gathered around her like something spilled and left. Her eyes found Dottie wide wet, searching for an anchor. One trembling hand reached toward the woman, grasping for the maternal warmth that the contract had included for 6 hours, and which had now officially lapsed. "Mom!" Claire whimpered the word, barely audible above the low hum of the crowd. "Mom? What do we do?" Dottie looked her over without warmth. No smile crossed her face. No arms opened. She checked her wristwatch, tapping the crystal with one lacquered fingernail. "Don't call me Mom, honey," Dottie said. Her voice carried clean across the room, raspy, blunt, nothing like the polished mid-Atlantic tone she'd performed all night. The contract concluded at 8:00. It is now 8:05, my clock has stopped. And I'll be straight with you, this environment is not safe to work in. Claire's mind was visibly stalling, trying to reconcile the stranger in front of her with the fiction she'd believed she married into. "Contract," she murmured. Up stepped Clem, the stand-in father. He worked his bow tie loose, freed the top collar button with a long exhale of relief, and looked down at Claire, the way a tradesman eyes a client whose payment cleared nothing. "Here's where things stand, lady," Clem said, leveling a finger. "We are professionals. The rehearsal dinner done, the meet and greet done. An hour-long ceremony top to bottom without a single yawn. We delivered everything we were hired to deliver." Derek's instructions were plain cash in hand the moment the speeches ended. He swept his gaze around the darkened hall, hunting the shadows for a groom who no longer existed. That cash never came. Clem told the room loud enough for everyone. "I do not work on credit. My car note is due Tuesday." The people nearest the stage quit their murmuring and leaned forward instead. The wedding had been one thing. This was something else. A collision unspooling in real time, impossible to look away from. Wait, you're actors." A woman in the front row couldn't hold the question in. I knew her face. Claire's college roommate. The one who'd spent years making Claire feel ashamed of where she'd grown up. Clem squared himself to the crowd and executed a slow, deliberate bow. "Clem Hartley, SAG-AFTRA, eligible at your service," he announced. "You may recognize my work from the Tri-State Mattress Depot commercials. I'm the fellow who sleeps on the cloud." A murmur of recognition rolled through the room. Somebody laughed. Short, involuntary, pure disbelief escaping. "Hold on," a man called from table 4. "You sat right there and told me offshore drilling made your fortune. We talked oil futures for 20 minutes. Yeah, I was riffing," Clem said, one shoulder rising in a shrug. "That's method acting. Looked it up on my phone during the drive over." Claire's humiliation had outgrown her. It was spreading now, a shockwave rolling through every table. She fought to her feet, heels skidding across the polished floor. "Stop it!" she screamed. "Stop, just stop! Derek's parents are here. You live on Cumberland Island. There is a yacht." Dottie pushed another stream of smoke toward the ceiling. "Honey, I rent a 2-bedroom in East Nashville and I ride the bus," she said, flat as pavement. "The only yacht I've ever set foot on is the Staten Island Ferry. Now, do you pay us or do we phone the police for theft of services?" Claire spun wildly. "Derek!" The shriek tore out of her. "Derek, make them stop." But Derek had been gone for some time. The moment the flood hit the deck, that rat was already over the rail. Claire stood alone in the wreckage she'd built. The 2 performers she'd hired to make herself look legitimate. The 2 strangers she'd placed above her own blood were now shaking her down for cash in front of 200 witnesses. Then the phones appeared. Slowly at first, a discreet raising of screens, a captured frame or two, But the scene was too absurd to resist, and everything gave way at once. The guests, these people Claire had so deliberately assembled, the crowd she'd burned so hard to impress, stopped being her supporters and became her opposition. Nobody moved to help. Everyone was recording. On my screen, I watched it unfold, a scatter of glowing rectangles lifting out of the dark, like insects drawn to a wound. The camera flashes strobed across her face, locking every shade of her panic into sharp, permanent focus. I could read their lips without sound. I knew precisely what they were doing. Broadcasting live, flooding their stories, hammering in the tags. Wedding fail, groom missing, fake parents. Claire pressed both palms over her face. There was no exit. No shadow to step into. She stood exposed in the open, every phone in the room pointed her direction, the cold blue light of social media holding her in place like a pin through a specimen. She wanted this, I thought, lifting my bourbon for a slow sip. The eyes, the moment, the room's full attention. She wanted to go viral. She wanted the whole world watching. Well, now they were. One bridesmaid, pink dress, an appearance that probably cost more than my whole house, moved to the lip of the stage. She made no move to reach for Claire. She raised her phone in front of her own face, hit record, and let Claire's sobbing fill the frame behind her. "Oh my God, you guys," she said loud enough to catch the security mic clean. "You will not believe this. The groom is a fraud. The parents are paid actors and the bride just got dumped at the altar because the checks bounced. This is literally the most insane thing I have ever seen." Claire heard every word. Her hands dropped from her face. She found the girl's eyes. "Trish," she whispered. "Please don't." Trish kept rolling. She just shifted her angle to frame the fake mother's cigarette better. "This is gold," Trish said. I watched Claire fold from the inside out. Fear was still in there, but something far heavier had layered on top of it. Understanding. The cold, complete, irreversible kind. These were never her people. They were spectators. And from the moment she walked into that room tonight, she had been the show. Dottie closed the gap between them, stepping into Claire's space without invitation. "Here's the situation, sweetheart," she said, the pleasant veneer entirely gone, something quieter and harder beneath it. "Derek owes us $2,000. He isn't here to settle it, which means it lands on you. You're the bride, you're the partner. So let's have it." "I don't have it," Claire sobbed. I don't have any money." Derek handled everything. "Then hand over the ring," Dottie said. I went rigid in my seat. "What?" Claire's hand flew to her chest, fingers closing around her left. "The ring," Dottie said again. She lunged forward and locked her grip around Claire's wrist. "Looks like a 2-carat stone to me. If it's genuine, that covers what you owe. If it turns out to be cubic zirconia, I will be extremely displeased." "No!" Claire shrieked, wrenching backward. "That is my engagement ring. It is collateral," Clem said, planting himself between Claire and the exit. "You give us the ring, we disappear. You refuse, we dial 911. Theft of services is a misdemeanor, but stack the dollar amount on top, and we start talking grand larceny." The guests had stopped pretending to be neutral. The laughter that broke out was not the polite kind. They were rooting for the actors. A chant rose up. "Give her the ring. Give her the ring." It had become a mob. Tuxedos, evening gowns. A mob all the same. These people had shown up expecting a feast and a party. Both had been stripped away. Now they wanted someone to bleed. They wanted a body on the altar. Claire scanned the room. Every face she saw, the faces of the people she had worked so hard to impress the people for whose sake she had erased me from the guest list. Every face wore the same ugly grin. She dropped her eyes to her trembling hand. The diamond caught a sliver of emergency light and threw it back like an accusation. "All right," she screamed. "Fine. Just take it." She tore the ring from her finger. She did not offer it to Dottie. She flung it across the room. It hit the floor, spinning a little wheel of fire, skipping through the dark. Dottie was faster than you'd expect. She crossed the floor and scooped it up before it could vanish into a floor vent. She lifted it into a shaft of emergency light and narrowed her eyes. "Not bad," Dottie announced. "Pawn shop'll move it quick enough." She cut a glance at Clem. "We're square." "We're square," Clem confirmed. He turned his eyes to Claire one final time. No apology. No farewell. He straightened his collar, tugged his tie into place, and stepped back into the role of a man with somewhere more important to be. "Pleasure doing business," he said. The two of them pivoted and walked off the stage, wading through the crowd of jeering guests without breaking stride. They slipped through the service doors and dissolved into the night, the symbol of my daughter's marriage riding in a jacket pocket beside a pack of cigarettes. Claire didn't move. She stood staring at her hand. Where the ring had lived, there was now only a pale band of skin, the one patch of her that the evening hadn't managed to soil. The guests filed out, their show over. Not one of them said goodbye to the bride. They moved around her the way you move around a lamp. I caught pieces of what they said as they drifted past the microphones. What a disaster. I always figured she was trash. Did you see which one was the real dad who does something like that? Claire went down to her knees on the stage floor among the dead flowers and the dark. The room had no ventilation, and the blooms had given up in the heat. The exit signs were the only light left, red and pitiless. She was alone in a way that doesn't have a softer word for it. I reached for my bottle of bourbon. Empty. Good. I set it aside. A clear head was exactly what I needed for the next part. The wrecking phase was done. I had brought the whole structure down, foundation, walls, everything. My daughter was crouched in the wreckage now. She hugged her knees and pressed her face into her arms. Her whole back heaved. I sat there and watched her. 1 minute, 2, 5. Then her hand went into her dress pocket and came out with her phone. The screen cast a pale glow across her wet face. She scrolled, found a number, and pressed call. My phone lit up on the desk. I read the name on the screen. Claire. I left it alone. 1 ring, 2, 3. Let her stay in that dark a little longer. Let her start to grasp that the man she'd had thrown off the property wasn't some spare part she could call up the moment things fell apart. I was not her safety net. The ringing quit. She pulled the phone away from her ear and stared at it like it had said something wrong. 29 years I had picked up, every single time. Tonight the line just sat there silent. She struggled upright on unsteady heels. One slow look around the empty room. Then the understanding settled over her. Nobody was riding to her rescue. Derek was gone. The hired family was gone. Every last guest was gone. Whatever happened next, she'd have to make it happen herself. I watched her step down from the stage. Her heel caught and she nearly went over, but she grabbed the back of a chair and steadied herself. She reached down and stripped off her shoes, left them on the floor like something discarded, like small fallen things. Then she turned and walked toward the door in bare feet. I folded the iPad cover shut. The screen died. I already knew her destination. There was nowhere else left to go. I crossed to the front door of my cabin, turned the deadbolt, but kept the chain fastened. She was on her way back. But she wasn't coming home to a safe place. She was coming to a gate, and I was the one deciding who got through. Then the phone screamed to life again, a raw, urgent ringing that tore through the stillness of the cabin. I looked at the glowing screen. Claire. I counted 4 rings and let them pass. I wanted her wrapped in that quiet. I wanted her to feel the full width of the gap she'd torn open between us. On the 5th, I answered. No greeting. I just held the phone to my ear and breathed. Dad. Claire screamed. I barely recognized her voice. It had been stripped down to something ragged and wild. Dad, what is going on? The manager is saying you killed the power. He's saying you control the trust. Tell him it's an error. Tell him to restore the lights. I drew in a slow breath. On the screen, I could see her moving in tight circles through the blackness, the phone pressed white-knuckled to the side of her head. It is not an error, Claire, I told her. My voice carried no heat. It was flat, and even the way you sound, reading off a list of facts. I triggered Clause 14C. The funding has been withdrawn. She let out a laugh, shrill, unhinged. Barely a laugh at all. You don't have funding. You live in a shack. Your truck barely holds together. Derek paid for all of this. Derek and his family. Derek is gone, Claire, I said. On the screen, she wheeled around, scanning the shadows for a husband who wasn't there. And his family, they were hired performers. Hourly workers. Their shift ended and they left. That's a lie, she screamed. You're doing this because you're jealous. Because I didn't put your name on the list. You didn't just leave my name off the list, Claire. I said it quietly. You put my face on a sign at the gate. Do not allow entry. You had me treated like a trespasser. The man who covered your dress, your flowers, your lobster dinner, you had him turned away at the door like he was nobody. So I cleared the table. Silence came down on the line like a dropped curtain. You're the one who paid, she breathed. Every cent, I said. $12,000. Derek's card was turned down for a drink at the lobby bar an hour ago. A single bourbon. He has nothing, Claire. He's had nothing since the moment you two met. No, she sobbed. That can't be right. He has millions. Crypto. A company. He has debt, I said, and I didn't soften it. $500,000 of gambling debt. He married you for the envelope money at the reception. He married you because he believed I was sitting on land he could liquidate. The sobbing got worse, long, tearing, full-body heaves. I watched her fold onto a chair and pull herself into a ball. Dad, please, she managed. I'm frightened. It's pitch black in here. Derek won't pick up. Come get me. Bring the truck. I don't even care about the truck. Just come. I looked at the key hook by the door. I looked at the empty bourbon bottle. I can't come, Claire. Why, she wept. You're my dad. Because I'm banned, I said. You remember the security guard's instructions? He said if I set foot on the property, he contacts the police. I have no interest in making a scene. I'm honoring the rules you set. Daddy, stop this. You're punishing me. I have no money. They repossessed the car. How do I get home? You have 2 feet, I said. It is 5 miles. There's a full moon out. You're expecting me to walk in a wedding dress. I want you to know what it is to be the one who gets turned away, I said. I want you to learn that you cannot spit on the hand that has been feeding you your whole life, and then hold that same hand out for more. Start walking, Claire. I set the phone down. Not hard, gently, the way you close a door when someone is sleeping. On the screen, she stood motionless, staring at the phone like she couldn't quite believe what had just happened. She jabbed at the screen, trying to redial. I reached over and pulled the cord from the wall. Lesson over. The real test was starting now. On the feed, I watched a shape peel away from the heavy velvet drapes near the service entrance. Not a ghost. A rat crawling back to the wreck to see what scraps remained. Derek lurched into the pool of emergency light. his movements twitchy and desperate. His jacket was gone. His shirt hung open to mid-chest, exposing a gold chain that had almost certainly never touched real gold in its life. He wasn't looking for his wife. His eyes went straight to the table where the gift box had been the one meant to collect envelopes of cash from the well-wishers. He crossed to it and found a bare tablecloth. The staff, thorough to the end, had cleared it out along with everything else. Derek drove his fist into the empty table. A dull, hollow sound. "Derek," Claire whispered. She pulled herself up off the floor, something desperate flickering behind her eyes. She actually believed he had come back for her. She thought he was riding back in to pull her out of the dark. "You came back?" She crossed the floor at a run, bare feet smacking the cold hardwood. She grabbed onto his arm with both hands. "Derek, thank God. My dad lost his mind. He killed the power. He said things, awful things. We need to get out of here right now." Derek wheeled around. No embrace, no comfort. He tore his arm free with enough force to send her staggering backward. "Where's the money, Claire?" he hissed. Gone was the smooth baritone he used on investors. What came out now was tight and high and ugly. "The cards, the envelopes. What did they do?" Claire stared at him. "The gifts. I don't know. The manager collected everything." "Derek, why does that matter right now? We need the police." "My dad, shut up about your dad." Derek's voice cracked into a shriek. Spittle caught the harsh emergency light. "Your dad is why I'm a dead man." He shut down the accounts. He froze the wire. "Do you have any idea what you've caused?" Claire stepped back, recoiling. "I didn't cause anything. I stood up for you. I had him banned for you. You didn't ban him nearly enough." Derek came toward her, driving her back toward the edge of the dance floor. "You told me he was a soft touch, a simple tradesman with a nest egg ripe for the taking. You never mentioned he was the shark who owns the whole tank." He seized her by the shoulders, fingers pressing hard into her skin. "Do you have cash anywhere?" he demanded, shaking her. "Your purse, the bridal suite. I need 50,000 right now." 50,000. Claire was sobbing. "Derek, you're scaring me. Why would you need money? We're wealthy. You have the company." Derek laughed. The sound of it was like breaking glass ground up in a disposal. "There is no company, you stupid cow," he spat. "There never was a company. It's a website I registered for $12. I needed your credit score. I needed your father's land. And now I have nothing because you couldn't keep the old man out of my way." I watched Claire's face come apart. Not just heartbreak, something deeper than that. The total erasure of everything she had built her world on. The man she had lifted above her own blood set up on a pedestal, was staring back at her with naked and undiluted contempt. You used me," she whispered. "I tried to," Derek said. "Turned out you were useless. You're a broke girl with a wealthy daddy who can't stand her. You're a liability." Then, at the far edge of the camera frame, I caught movement at the rear service doors, the ones I had instructed Hartley to unlock remotely 3 minutes ago. 3 men entered the ballroom. They were not wedding guests. Leather jackets too heavy for the weather. Expressions too measured for the chaos around them. They moved with the unhurried, flat-footed tread of men who are accustomed to walking through whatever is in front of them. I recognized the one in the center. It was Bruno the loan shark Keating had flagged in the dossier. Derek saw them too. He went perfectly still. His grip on Claire's shoulders locked down until she cried out. "Derek!" Bruno called across the empty ballroom. His tone was almost warm, conversational, like they were old friends at a reunion. "Leaving already? We never got to raise a glass to the happy couple." Derek spun Claire around and put her between himself and the three men. He used my daughter as a shield. Bruno. Derek stammered, peering out from behind Claire's shoulder. There's been a mix-up. The wire got flagged by the bank's security system. You know how these things go. I'll have it sorted Monday morning first thing. Bruno kept moving, same pace, no hurry. Monday's a long way off, Derek, he said. My associates don't sit easy over the weekend. Word reached us that the wedding fell apart. Word reached us the money evaporated. Makes us wonder if you're thinking about a change of scenery. No, Derek yelped. No scenery? Look, she has it! He shoved Claire forward, pushing her out toward the men. She's the one. Her dad is Harold Drummond. He owns this entire property. Take her, hold her. He'll pay whatever you want. He loves her. Claire lurched forward, barely catching her balance before she reached Bruno. She turned back to look at her husband. Her face was pure horror. Derek, she gasped. What are you saying? Give them your jewelry, Derek screamed at her. The necklace, the earrings, hand it over. It's fake, Claire whispered, her fingers rising to her throat. You told me it was vintage. I brought it in to be cleaned, and they told me it's paste. You bought it at a kiosk. Derek's face contorted. His last card, his final bargaining chip, had always been worthless. He had run his own con on himself. Bruno stopped 5 feet away. He looked at Claire, standing there, shivering in her ruined dress. He looked at the costume jewelry at her throat. He shook his head slowly. We're not here for the girl, Derek. Bruno said, his voice unchanged. You signed the marker. We're here for you. Derek looked left. Looked right. Every exit he knew was covered. The animal part of his brain took over, cornered, frantic, no way out. He lunged for Claire one final time. Not to protect her, not to hold her. He grabbed the bodice of her dress and hauled. Get out of my way, he shrieked. It wasn't a shove. He put the full weight of his cowardice and desperation behind it. Claire went flying backward, her feet tangled in layers of silk and tulle, nothing to grip on the slick floor. For a half-second she was suspended, a white shape hanging in the blackness. Then she came down hard onto the centerpiece from table 4, which the staff had moved to the floor during cleanup. A towering arrangement of white peonies and gardenias in a tall vase of water. Claire hit it with a sickening crack. The vase exploded. Water sheeted across the floor, mixing with overturned soil and shattered glass. She rolled off the wreckage and struck the ground. Her dress pulled up the water, the mud, the crushed petals like a wick. She lay there, spread across the ruins of the evening, white petals plastered to her wet hair, the shoulder seam of her gown torn open. She looked like something that had once been beautiful and had fallen too far to recover. Derek never looked back. He used the moment of her crash to run. He vaulted chairs, sent a bus cart clattering across the floor, and drove himself toward the kitchen doors. Get him, Bruno said. Quiet, almost gentle. The 2 men on either side of him moved, faster than their build suggested. They cut Derek off before he reached the swinging doors. One of them brought him down in a tackle that sent him skidding across the polished wood floor. Then they hauled him up under the arms. Derek was weeping, bargaining, threatening all at once. They walked him out through the back into the night where their car sat waiting. Bruno looked at Claire one last time. She was on the floor, trying to push herself upright, hands sliding on the wet, flour-covered ground, breath coming in shallow, stunned gasps. Sorry you had to see all that, Bruno told her. But you tied yourself to the wrong man. He turned and walked out. Claire was alone in the center of the frame. I zoomed in on the feed. It was the image that would stay with me because it had to. She was on her hands and knees amid the broken glass and dying blooms. The white dress, everything it had stood for, every delusion it had dressed up, was destroyed. gray with filthy water, green streaked from the crushed stems. She raised her head slowly. Her mascara had tracked down her face in long black lines. She looked around at the silent, empty room. "Daddy," she whispered. The microphone caught every word of it. It was a small sound, a broken sound. "Daddy, I'm hurt." I sat in my cabin. My finger hung over the call button on my phone. Every instinct I had screamed at me to go to her, get in the truck drive, through that gate, scoop her up and set her right. But I pulled my hand back. If I ran to her now, she would never learn to get up on her own. If I washed her off, she'd never feel the weight of what her choices had made. She had to sit in those flowers. She had to feel that cold water. She had to look at the wreckage she had brought through the door herself. This was the bottom, and she had to hit it without a hand to catch her. The security gates of Magnolia Bluff Resort sealed shut with a mechanical finality that rang out like a prison door closing. But Claire wasn't on the inside anymore. She was on the outside. The patch of pavement where my truck had leaked oil that morning was now the starting line of her reckoning. She stood there a long time beneath the yellow wash of the street lamp. I couldn't see her anymore. The resort cameras didn't reach Old Mill Road, but I knew precisely what she was staring at. 5 miles of asphalt, gravel, and darkness. A road she had traveled 100 times as a child, in the back of my truck, grumbling about every bump. Now she'd feel each one against the soles of her feet. She took the first step. She was still wearing one shoe. The other had been lost somewhere back in the lobby, kicked off in her desperate chase after a husband who was already gone. She tried to walk with an uneven, limping gait. The remaining stiletto heel struck the tarmac like a metronome, ticking down her misery. Click, scrape, click, scrape. After about 100 yards, she stopped. She sat on the guardrail, the metal cold and damp against her skin. She unbuckled the remaining shoe and hurled it into the ditch. It landed in the tall grass, a $1,000 piece of Italian leather tossed aside like a fast food wrapper. Barefoot now. Her pedicure, a soft shell pink she'd been showing off on Instagram just yesterday, didn't stand a chance against Old Mill Road. The asphalt was old, rough, pitted with potholes, scattered with loose gravel. She started walking again. No clicking this time. Just the soft, wet slap of bare skin on stone. A car came up from behind. I imagine she spun around, waving her arms, the diamonds on her bracelet catching the headlights. She probably figured it was a guest. Maybe Trish. Maybe one of the groomsmen who had raised a glass to her eternal happiness just an hour before. The car didn't slow. It drifted slightly to avoid the woman in the soiled white dress staggering along the shoulder, then sped up. The wind from its passing whipped her hair across her face and pelted gravel against her legs. They didn't see a bride. They saw a wild woman walking alone in the dark. They saw trouble. She kept moving. The adrenaline from the ballroom was draining away, replaced by the dull, throbbing weight of reality. Her dress, the custom silk masterpiece, had grown heavy. It had soaked up the water from the flower vases, and now it was pulling up dew from the roadside weeds. It dragged behind her, collecting burrs, twigs, and mud. It wasn't a gown anymore. It was an anchor. She had to bunch the fabric in her fists and hold it to her chest, like a pile of dirty laundry, just to keep moving. Mile 2. The blisters would have started by then. Soft skin grinding against rough pavement. The friction building to heat, then to fluid, then to raw, exposed nerve. She stepped on something sharp. She cried out, I know she did. She sat right down in the middle of the road to check her foot. In the moonlight, the blood would have looked black. She probably checked her phone again. She had a signal out there. She could see the notifications rolling in the tags, the comments. The world wasn't sleeping. The world was laughing. Every step she took away from the resort carried her deeper into viral infamy. She wasn't just walking home. She was walking down a digital hall of mirrors, every reflection warped and mocking. She called Derek again, straight to voicemail. She called Trish, straight to voicemail. She called her mother's old number, a number that had been disconnected for 10 years, just to hear a voice that wouldn't judge her. She stood back up. She was limping for real now. The cold was setting in. The night air in the valley drops fast. She was wearing thin silk against desperation. She wrapped her arms around herself, shaking hard. Mile 3. This was the stretch with no streetlights, just a canopy of oaks shutting out the moon. Pitch black. The sounds of the night, the crickets, the rustling in the brush, the hoot of an owl would have sounded like monsters to a girl who had spent the last 5 years in the city. She was afraid of the dark. She always had been. I used to leave the hall light on for her. Tonight the only light was the distant glow of my cabin, a tiny pinprick of yellow miles off. She started to run, a clumsy, hobbling jog. She wanted out of the darkness. She wanted the safety of the place she used to call a shack. The irony must have tasted like ash. The luxury resort had shown her the door. The penthouse was a lie. The shack was the only roof left in the world that wouldn't charge her admission. She tripped. It was always going to happen. Exhaustion and darkness and uneven ground, a brutal combination. She went down hard on her hands and knees. The gravel chewed into her palms. She didn't get right back up. She stayed there on all fours, gasping, retching on the emptiness in her stomach. She looked at her hands. Scraped, bleeding, filthy. They looked just like my hands. She had spent her entire adult life trying to scrub the construction worker out of her blood. She got manicures. She used expensive lotions. She wore gloves when she drove. But now, kneeling in the dirt, mixing her blood with the earth, she was exactly the person she had been running from. She was a Drummond, down in the mud. She pulled herself up. She was crying a low, keening sound with no audience but the trees. She didn't wipe her face. She just let the tears run through the road dust streaking her cheeks. Mile 4. She could make out the line of my property, the fence I had built myself, the gate she had cruised past a week ago in a rented Jaguar, laughing at how plain it was. Now that gate looked like the pearly gates of heaven. She dragged one foot, then the other. She was leaving a trail of bloody footprints on the asphalt, stripping away the layers of pretension with every agonizing yard. The entitlement was gone. The arrogance was gone. All that remained was survival. She reached the turnoff for my driveway. The gravel here was fresh, sharp. It must have felt like walking on shattered glass. She saw the lights of the cabin. She saw my truck parked out front. The truck she had despised. The truck she had forbidden. She didn't look at it with contempt tonight. She looked at it with longing. She walked past the hood, her hand trailing along the rusted fender, needing something solid beneath her fingers. She stumbled up the 3 wooden steps to the porch. She stood in front of the door. She raised a hand, shaking, bloody, stripped of its diamond ring. She didn't knock. She collapsed against the wood, sliding down until she was a heap of ruined white silk on my welcome mat. She had walked 5 miles through hell to get back to where she started, but she hadn't crossed the finish line yet. The door was locked, and I was on the other side waiting. I heard the thud of her body hitting the wood, then a low, guttural sob that vibrated through the doorframe. Then came the pounding. Not a polite knock, the frantic, desperate hammering of someone who feels the wolves closing in. I stood on the other side of the oak door, my hand resting on the deadbolt. I could hear her breathing, ragged and wet like a swimmer breaking the surface after nearly going under. "Open the door!" she screamed. Her voice was cracked and raw from 5 miles of crying in the dark. "Dad, open the damn door! It's me!" I unlocked the deadbolt. The metal slide clicked back with a heavy mechanical snap. I turned the knob, but I didn't swing this door open wide. I had put the security chain on earlier, a thick link of hardened steel. The door opened 4 inches. Just enough to see her. Just enough for her to see me. The slice of her face visible through that gap was a portrait of ruin. Mud and leaves were tangled through her hair. The mascara had tracked down her face in dark smears pooling beneath her eyes like bruises. Her cheek had opened up a thin cut weeping blood into the grime already caked there. The smell hit me even through the gap bog water and sweat, and a perfume that had curdled into something unrecognizable. She jammed her arm into the opening fingers, scrabbling toward the chain. Those fingers were a wreck, raw, bleeding the polished ground down to nothing. "Let me in," she choked out, grasping at air. "It's freezing out here. I'm hurt. Open it right now." I didn't touch the chain. I stood my ground, holding the glass of water I'd poured earlier and never brought to my lips. I watched her fingers search for something to grip in a home she'd called a shack a week ago. "This door stays closed, Claire," I said. Quiet, flat, no heat behind it at all. Anger burns. This was ice. "What?" Her clawing stopped. She pressed her eye against the crack, and what I saw looking back at me was disbelief tipping toward panic. "What did you just say?" "I said you're not coming in," I told her. "You made your position clear. I don't belong in the life you built. You posted a sign to say so. You put a man at the gate to enforce it. You drew that boundary yourself. Well, here it is. This side is mine." The sound she made was somewhere between a shriek and a laugh. "Have you lost your mind? 5 miles I walked. I'm bleeding all over your porch. Derek walked out on me. He cleaned me out. You blew up my wedding. You miserable old man. And you're standing there telling me to stay outside." "I didn't blow up anything, Claire," I said. "I pulled the funding from a fraud." "That's a different thing entirely." She threw her shoulder into the door. The chain went taut, held firm. 3-inch screws sunk into solid framing. I'd put every one of them in myself. "You pulled the funding." Her voice cracked into a higher register. "So humiliating me in front of every person I know. That's just collateral damage. Derek is going to drag you through court. He'll reduce this place to scrap lumber." I raised the glass and took a slow sip. The cold water kept me level. "Derek won't be filing anything, Claire. Right now, Derek is riding in the back of a black SUV trying to explain to a man named Bruno why he's $50,000 short." That stopped her cold. The name landed, and she felt it. Bruno, who is Bruno? A loan shark. I said the same way I'd explain how to square a wall. "He's holding the paper on Derek's gambling debts. $540,000, Claire. That's the hole your husband is in. That's the reason he needed a bride. The wedding gifts were a payment to stay breathing another week." "That's a lie," she breathed, forehead dropping against the doorframe. "He built nebulous systems from nothing. He's brilliant." I turned crossed to the small hallway table and picked up what I'd left there earlier. The background check. 1 page folded lengthwise. I worked it through the gap and let her take it. "Have a read," I said. She yanked it out of my fingers. Through the crack, I watched her spread the sheet, open hands, trembling badly enough that the paper shook. The porch bulb threw just enough light. Her eyes swept the lines. Work history, car, rental desk, cell phone, kiosk, let go for theft. Credit score 420, 6 active judgments. She let go of it. The page drifted down and soaked into a mud puddle at her feet. You manufactured that," she said. The certainty wasn't there, though. "You've always been threatened by him." because he was polished, because he made something of himself, because he wasn't standing in a ditch swinging a hammer. I studied her face through the narrow opening. Really studied it. She was shaking hard now, the last of the adrenaline burning away the cold, rushing in to fill the space it left. I wasn't threatened by him, Claire. I despised him because he was a predator. And I despised what he did. He persuaded you that the man who kept a roof over your head for 18 years wasn't worthy of a seat at your table. The crying that came next wasn't the raw kind. It was the practiced kind, the same performance she'd run on me when she wanted a later curfew or a new phone. "Daddy, please," she sobbed. "The sign, I'm sorry about the sign." "Okay, I am." It was Derek's idea. He told me his family was difficult. He said they wouldn't get your background. I was managing the situation. I was keeping you from looking bad. "Not keeping me from looking bad?" I repeated. I shifted closer to the door. "You weren't shielding me from anything, Claire. You were guarding your own image. You glanced at my truck and filed me under failure. You looked at these hands and all you registered was dirt. Not what built the thing. Not what it cost. Just something that clashed with the version of yourself you were selling online." "I already said I'm sorry." She smacked the wood again. "I said it. Now take the chain off. I've got no place to sleep. They locked me out of the apartment." "Yes," I said. "They did. I terminated the lease guarantee." "You what?" She pulled back. Her eyes went wide. "You were the one backing it. Who covered the rent every month? Derek's wire transfers evaporated into thin air," I asked. "Who kept your car insured? Think about it. Who do you suppose paid for the dress you've been destroying on my road tonight?" Her gaze dropped to the ruined silk. Her fingers pressed into the torn fabric. "You," she said softly. "All of it," I said. 3 years, Claire. Every shortfall, every so-called emergency, every time Derek's cash flow dried up, I was behind it. Shell accounts, so you'd never trace it back. I did it because I wanted you to stand on your own feet and feel good about it. I was your net the whole time. Tonight, I cut it loose. "Why?" The word tore out of her. "Why do any of this if you've got the money? Why hole up in this place? Why drive that heap? Why dress the way you dress? You set me up. You let me believe you had nothing." "I never told you a thing," I said, and I felt my voice go to stone. "You drew your own conclusions. You skimmed the surface and called it research. You decided what I was before you'd looked past the cover. You never once asked about my work. Never asked where the money came from. You called me when you needed a check. That was the extent of your curiosity. Let me be clear about where things stand," I continued. "What Derek could steal across 10 lifetimes wouldn't touch what I'm worth. The resort where you got married, I own it. The ground this cabin sits on, and 300 units in the city mine. I am a wealthy man. But this is the house I raised with your mother, and I live in it because it means something. That truck runs fine, and I've never needed a luxury badge to know what I am." She watched me through that narrow gap. The numbers were rearranging themselves behind her eyes. I could see it happening. Shame and appetite pulling in opposite directions. She'd bet everything on the wrong man. She'd traded away a father who had real money for a husband who owed his life to loan sharks. "Dad." The register dropped, went soft. "Dad, listen, if you've got all of that, nothing is really broken yet. We clear Derek's debt. We put the apartment right. You step in, and this goes away. I'm your daughter. I'm the only one you have. You can't leave me standing in the dark." I glanced at the chain, the links biting into the bolt plate, as her weight pressed the door. I won't be writing any more checks, Claire. That's finished. What? She flinched as if I'd struck her. You don't have a choice, I'm your child. I had one job as your father, I said. Raise a decent human being. I didn't get there. I padded your life too much. I absorbed too much on your behalf. I taught you by accident that the world exists to accommodate you, that the people clearing your plates and hauling your garbage are beneath your notice. They are beneath me. The words came out before she could reel them back in the whole careful facade sliding away at once. I earned my degree. I run a creative department. You answer phones with a director title on your business card, Claire. I said no softness in it. And come morning, you won't even have that. I know you ran the florist deposit through the company card. The moment I report it as unauthorized, your employer will have everything they need. You are standing at zero. The only currency that counts now is what you're capable of making with your own hands. And at this particular moment, those hands have nothing in them. Her eyes fell to her palms. She turned them over, the blood, the gravel embedded in the skin. This is where we land, she said, barely above a whisper. You watch me fall apart out here and call it a lesson. You let me freeze over hurt feelings. I'm not watching you die, I said. And my feelings have nothing to do with it. Whatever I felt for myself went cold the night I saw that sign. This is about who you've become. You're broken, Claire. All the way through. You treat people like they're replaceable. You've turned family into a business arrangement. You perform love, put it on for whoever's watching. I slid the chain free. She lurched forward, ready to push her way through. I planted my boot against the base of the door and stopped her cold, wedged it there, holding the wood firm. I looked straight at her through those few inches of gap. You're not getting in, I said, because if I let you through that door, here's what happens. You take a long, hot shower, you eat my food, you sleep in your old room, and come morning, the hate is right back. You'll hate me for seeing you at your lowest. You'll hate me for having what you want. You'll start working out how to take it. You won't learn a thing. Then what am I supposed to do? She screamed, and I felt the spit hit my face. Where exactly do you expect me to go? I reached into my pocket and pulled out a key. Plain silver, plain ring. I worked it through the gap and let it drop. It hit the porch boards with a small metallic ring. That opens Unit 4B at the tenements on Depot Street, I said. Studio apartment, hot plate mattress, rents covered for a month. There's a bus pass on the counter and a job application for the diner downstairs. The tenements. Her voice went up. That's the slums. That's where you grew up. Exactly, I said. That's my starting line. That's the place that taught me you don't eat unless you earn it. That's where I figured out a man's value isn't the cut of his jacket, it's whether his word is any good. I am not setting foot in that building, she said. I am Claire Drummond. You are Claire, I told her. The rest is just a claim you haven't backed up yet. Prove it. She stared at the key lying in the dirt. She stared at me. I hate you. She said each word slow and deliberate. More than anything. I know, I said, and I kept my voice quiet. And that's the whole problem. You only love what I can hand you. You don't love me. I started to ease back from the door. Dad, wait. Panic hit her voice as she felt the moment closing. Dad, please, it's dark. I'm scared. You should be, I said. The world doesn't pull its punches when there's no one picking up your tab. I kept pulling the door toward me. "Dad," she screamed. "Dad, I'll do whatever you say, I'm sorry." "Pick up the key, Claire," I said through the shrinking gap. "Pick it up and get moving. The bus stop is a mile down Old Mill Road. Last bus is at 4:00 a.m. You've got time." "My feet," she sobbed. "They'll toughen up," I said. "Feet do that when they carry you somewhere." I looked at her one final time. Her face lit by the porch light was a ruin hollow, streaked desperate. "I am not being cruel, Claire. I'm giving you the lesson that should have come 10 years ago. I'm teaching you what it looks like to carry your own weight. This is the last gift I have. I'm giving you a floor to push off from." I shut the door, threw the deadbolt, slid the chain home. Her scream came through the wood, all fury and helplessness, nothing left to bargain with. She beat on the door for another 10 minutes. She cursed me. She cursed Derek. She cursed everything she could name. Then it went quiet. I waited. 5 minutes, 10. A shuffle of movement on the porch. Then the slow, uneven sound of footsteps moving away. I went to the window and looked through the blinds. She was making her way down the driveway, one hand bunching the dress up off the ground. The other hand had the silver key in a tight fist, held like it was the only solid thing left in the world. She was heading toward the road, toward the bus stop, toward the bottom. I turned off the porch light. The work had started. I parked my truck across from the tenement building on Depot Street and sat in the dark cab waiting. I'd taken the back roads, the route I'd memorized from years as a framing contractor, and I beat Claire there by 20 minutes. I watched the bus stop half a block down, empty. The streetlights buzzed and guttered, throwing a sick yellow wash across cracked sidewalks and dumpsters spilling over at the curb. This was the stretch the city council never got around to fixing, where sirens were just part of the ambient sound and hope was traded at a steep discount. 20 minutes later, there she was. She came out of the shadows at the alley's edge, listing badly to one side. She'd walked the whole way, hadn't taken the bus. Maybe she couldn't bear to stand under fluorescent light in a ruined wedding dress in front of strangers. Maybe she needed to punish herself with every step. She looked like a figure out of a nightmare, a smeared gray shape hauling a train of silk that had stopped being a dress sometime around mile 2. She pulled up in front of the building. 4 stories of brick that had its best days sometime in the 1950s. Bars on the windows. A steel front door dented from years of being forced open. She looked at the numbers above the door. 412. She looked down at the key in her palm. She was shaking badly enough that I could read it from across the street. I got out of the truck. The door slammed behind me, loud as a shot in the stillness. Claire spun on around, eyes wide with fear. When she saw my face, her shoulders dropped. Not relief. Something heavier than that. Defeat. "You were already here," she rasped. "I own the building, Claire," I said, crossing toward her. "I know the quick way." She turned and looked up at the facade. 2nd floor, a baby was crying. 3rd floor, a couple was going at it. Voices loud enough to carry. The air was thick with stale beer and boiled cabbage. "This is it?" she asked. "This is what you want for me? This is where you're going to be?" I said, not a question. "Come on." I stepped past her and pushed the front door. The lock had been busted for a decade. I held it open. She stood there taking in the dark, graffiti-covered hallway. Then she crossed the threshold. We went up without talking. The elevator had caution tape across the doors, out of order. We climbed 4 flights. The stairwell carried equal parts bleach and urine. Claire gagged and pressed her hand over her nose, but she kept moving. The street was the alternative. She had no better option. We reached 4B. I took the key from her shaking hand, turned the lock, pushed the door in. Hit the switch. A single bulb in the center of the ceiling blinked on bare, hard honest. It showed everything the room had, which wasn't much, maybe 300 square feet. Linoleum flooring peeling up at the corners. A twin mattress on the floor in the far corner dressed with sheets that were cheap but clean. A table and one chair. Hot plate on the counter beside a mini fridge. The walls had been painted something meant to be cream, but the years had pulled it toward the color of an old cigarette. Claire walked to the center of the room and turned in a slow circle. Looked at the barred window and the brick wall beyond it. Looked at the bathroom door that wouldn't sit square in the frame. "It's a cell," she said. "It's a beginning," I said. I closed the door and put my back against it. "This isn't punishment, Claire. This is history. You don't recognize this place, do you?" It wasn't a question. She looked at me, fatigue and confusion tangled together on her face. "Why would I know this place?" "Because you lived here," I said. "First 2 years of your life. Unit 4B. I carried you and your mother in from the hospital and put you down right where that mattress sits. I mixed concrete during the day and studied blueprints at night right here. Your mother cut curtains from leftover fabric scraps so the windows felt like something." She turned and looked at the walls slowly, as though the old paint might give something up. "We were glad to be here," I went on. "No money, no standing, none of that. But we had each other, and we had something to work toward. We clawed our way out of this room, Claire. We didn't marry our way out. We didn't con our way out. We laid every board ourselves." I crossed to the small table. A folder was sitting on it. I opened it. "Here's the arrangement," I said. No softness in my voice, no room to negotiate. "Rent on this unit is paid for a full year. Utilities are in your name, prepaid for 3 months. After that, they're yours to cover." I pointed to the form next to the folder. "That's a job application for Hank's Diner downstairs. I know the owner. He's expecting you at 6 tomorrow morning. Minimum wage plus tips. You'll wear the uniform, you'll pour the coffee, you will wipe down tables, and you will do it with a smile." "I can't wait tables," she sobbed. "I have a degree in art history." "Your degree didn't flag the con man standing next to you at the altar," I said. "Maybe carrying plates will teach you something a degree couldn't. The difference between what you want and what you actually need." I pulled a prepaid flip phone from my jacket pocket and dropped it onto the mattress. "That's your phone. My number is in it. Police, fire department. What it doesn't have is Instagram, your friends' numbers, any of that. You're going offline, Claire. You're going to vanish from the world you knocked yourself out trying to impress." She stared at the cheap plastic handset. Next to the smartphone she'd lost, it looked like a toy from a vending machine. "And if I say no?" she asked, her voice unsteady. "If I walk out, then you walk out," I said. "The door isn't locked. But if you leave Claire, you leave me too. No inheritance, no contact, no net to fall into. You become someone I used to know." I let that land. Then I let my voice drop just a fraction. "If you stay, if you make it a full year, if you can show me you're capable of living on what you earn, of standing without propping yourself up on a man or a trust fund, then we talk." "And talk about what?" she asked, dragging the back of her hand across her nose. "About a position in my company," I said. "Not director, not VP, entry level. You start at the bottom and learn what the business actually is. You find out what it takes to build something real." She looked at me. Her eyes were swollen and red, scraped clean of the arrogance that had lived there for the better part of 10 years. She looked at the mattress on the floor, the hot plate, the dress hanging off her in ruins. She was still wearing the costume from a production that had collapsed around her. And she understood, finally, that the deck in her hand was empty. Derek had gutted her future. I had pulled the floor out from under her. She was standing on nothing. I watched the last of her fight leave her body. Her shoulders caved. Her chin went down. "Okay," she said, barely a sound. "What?" I asked. I wanted to hear it. "Okay," she said again, her voice finding some weight. "I'll stay. I'll do it." "Good," I said. I walked to the door, put my hand on the knob. There are clothes in the closet. I went to Walmart. Jeans, t-shirts, work shoes. Get out of that dress, Claire. Burn it. It stopped fitting you a long time ago. I opened the door. "Dad," I stopped. Didn't turn around. Did you really ban yourself?" she asked. "Did you let them put that sign up?" I looked into the dark hallway ahead of me. "No, Claire," I said. "You put the sign up. I just enforced it." I walked out. The door clicked shut behind me. I stood for a moment in that stale hallway listening. I heard her moving across the linoleum, the rustle of the dress, and then the pipes knocked and the shower came on. She was washing the mud off, washing the mascara off, washing the lie off. I went down the stairs, my boots loud in the quiet stairwell, climbed into my truck and turned the key. I didn't pull away right off. I sat there a long time with the engine idling, watching the lit window of apartment 4B. The lights stayed on. It was the hardest thing I had ever done, leaving my child in a place like that. Leaving her to scrub dishes and count out change. Every nerve in me as a father wanted to go back up those stairs, put a blanket around her shoulders, and bring her home. Tell her to forget the whole night. But a parent's job isn't only to shield their children. It's to shape them for what's coming. And Claire wasn't shaped for anything. She was soft, entitled, fragile, in the ways that actually matter. If I pulled her out of this now, she'd stay fragile forever. But if I let her crack all the way through, there was a chance she'd put herself back together into something that could last. I dropped it into gear and rolled away from the curb. The road ahead was dark, but for the first time since that morning, I felt something close to hope. She hadn't bolted. She hadn't folded. She had stayed. The demolition was done. The foundation was set. The real work was only beginning. I kept watch through the cab of my truck parked down the block as the seasons turned. Summer burned off into autumn, pulling the leaves from the trees along Depot Street and leaving the tenement raw and plain against a colorless sky. Winter followed, painting the windows of apartment 4B with frost that traced patterns like prison bars on the glass. I never went inside. I never called. But I saw her. Every morning at 5:30, she came out of that building. Early on, she walked with her head tucked down, shoulders rolled forward against the cold, wearing the cheap coat I'd hung in the closet. She looked like someone working off a sentence. But the months have a way of reshaping a person. Her posture opened up. Her stride got longer. She stopped watching the ground and started looking out at what was ahead. I went into Hank's diner sometimes, always sliding into the back booth where the light was low cap pulled down. I watched her work. It was hard watching. The morning rush at a diner like that is controlled chaos, plates crashing, orders flying, and customers who figure a couple of dollars in tips buys them the right to treat the staff like furniture. I watched a man in a pressed suit snap his fingers at her because his toast had gone cold. "Excuse me, sweetie," he said. I've got a meeting in 10 minutes. This is garbage. Take it back. The Claire from a year ago would have put the plate through the window, would have told him what her shoes used to cost. But this Claire didn't move a muscle in her face. She picked up the plate. "I'm sorry about that, sir," she said, her voice level and professional. "I'll have a fresh order out to you right away." She turned and headed for the kitchen, sidestepping a busboy balancing a tower of dirty dishes. No tears, no complaint to the manager. She just handled it. I watched her count her tips at the end of a shift. She sat at the counter in her stained uniform, coffee and ketchup, the badges of the job sorting crumpled singles and loose coins into tidy columns. I could see her lips moving through the math. Rent, electric, food, bus fare. A Tuesday in March, I followed her to the grocery store. Not the Whole Foods she used to drift through with a basket of things she'd never finish. A discount market, the kind with humming fluorescent lights and produce that's seen better days. She carried a handbasket, not a cart. She picked up a package of ground beef, read the price, set it back down, chose a box of store-brand pasta instead. She stood at the checkout and counted out exact change from a small coin purse. She came up 5 cents short. The cashier, a teenager who looked like she'd been there since before sunrise, sighed. I watched Claire's face go red. Not the hot red of anger, the quiet red of real shame. She didn't demand a supervisor, didn't slide across a card that wasn't hers. "Take the apple off," Claire said quietly. I don't need the apple. That was the moment I knew. The entitlement hadn't just faded, it had been burned out entirely. What replaced it was something harder and more honest, the arithmetic of a life you pay for yourself. She had learned the rule that can't be taught in a classroom. You cannot spend what you have not made. Spring came. The ice let go. Claire was still there. No old friend had swept in to rescue her. No new wealthy man had materialized to take Derek's place. She was pulling double shifts. She was lean. Her hands were rough from bleach and hot water, but her eyes had changed. The frantic, cornered look of the woman on my porch was gone. What I saw in its place was the steady, quiet gaze of someone who had made it through the dark and knew she could do it again. Exactly 1 year to the day after the wedding, I pushed through the door of Hank's diner at 10 in the morning. The breakfast rush had cleared out. The place smelled of bacon grease and cleaning spray. I didn't take the back booth this time. I sat at a table by the window. Claire was behind the counter working a cloth over the pie case. She glanced up. She went completely still. The rags stopped. She looked at me. I looked at her. She didn't come running, didn't call out Dad across the room. She set the cloth down. She picked up a coffee pot and a clean mug. She came around the counter and walked to my table. She poured the coffee. Black, no sugar, exactly the way I take it. "Hello, Dad," she said, steady, calm. "Hello, Claire," I said. She set the pot down, reached into her apron and pulled out her order pad. "What can I get you?" she asked. "The special today is meatloaf. Oh, actually, it's pretty good today. Hank made it fresh." I looked at her. She had a name tag pinned to her uniform that said Claire. No title, no pretension, just her name. "I'm not here to eat," I said. "I came to talk business." "Business?" she asked. She didn't pull out a chair. She stayed on her feet, respectful of the customer, respectful of the man. I reached into my jacket. Not a checkbook. A single manila folder. I slid it across the laminate tabletop. "Open it," I said. She wiped both hands on her apron before she touched it. She lifted the cover. 1 sheet of papers inside. An employment contract. A Magnolia Bluff resort. She read out loud. Position Junior Operations Associate. It's entry-level, I said. You'll answer to the housekeeping manager. You'll inspect rooms, handle guest complaints, work the holidays. The salary is $45,000 a year. Enough to keep a decent roof over your head, not a penthouse, but somewhere the heat actually works. She raised her eyes to mine. You want me to work at the place where all of it happened? I want you to learn how to run it, I said. I let the general manager go last week. He took a little too much pleasure in humiliating you that night. I need somebody who understands what it means to build from nothing. Somebody who's been on the outside of a locked door, so they'll never do that to a paying guest. She looked back down at the contract. Her thumb moved slowly over the resort's logo. And if I say no, then you stay right here, I said. You're a good waitress, Claire. Hank thinks highly of you. You can build a decent life in this diner. There's no shame in that. She closed the folder. She held it flat against her chest. Why? She asked. Why now? Because you stayed, I said. Because you counted out pennies for a box of pasta and didn't complain about it. Because in 12 months you never once picked up that phone to ask me for anything. You served your time, Claire. You laid your foundation. Now I'm handing you the materials to build the rest. The tears came up in her eyes, but she held them there. She pulled in a long breath and gave a single nod. I accept, she said. But on one condition. I raised an eyebrow. You're negotiating. I want to pay you back, she said. The wedding, the dress, the rent on that apartment upstairs. I know it'll take years, but I want a payment plan. Take it straight out of my salary. I studied her face, the set of her jaw, the thing in her blood that had finally surfaced. Deal, I said. She reached across the table and took my hand. Her palm was rough. There were calluses on it. It felt like my hand. Table 4 is out of coffee, she said, letting go. I finish my shift at 2. Pick me up then. I'll be outside, I said. She turned and walked back behind the counter. No strut, just purpose. I watched her go. I lifted the cup she'd poured and took a sip. Hot. Strong. It was the best cup of coffee I'd ever had. The sign at the gate was gone. That cup of coffee Claire poured me that morning, black, no sugar, just the way I take it, was worth more than anything served at that $212,000 wedding. She had earned the right to pour it. I won't pretend any of this was easy. There were nights parked outside that tenement on Depot Street when I nearly went back up those stairs. When I nearly traded the lesson for the comfort of just being her dad again. But I believe God doesn't let the hard things come into your life without a purpose behind them. The Lord's timing on that year of silence, every shift Claire worked, every penny she counted, was not wasted. It built something in her that no amount of money I could have handed over would ever have bought. These are the kinds of father stories that don't make the highlight reel. They live in the quiet moments, in a diner booth, in a handshake with a calloused palm. Here is what I'd tell any parent sitting with a hard decision tonight. First, protecting your child from every consequence is not love. It is a slow theft of the person they were meant to become. Second, when someone shows you who they are, believe them, but don't stop believing they can change if the cost is real enough. Third, family justice is not about revenge. It is about refusing to fund someone's destruction of themselves. And fourth, the bottom is not the end. It is the only place some people can finally find solid ground to push off from. If this story landed with you today, share it with someone who needs to hear it, a parent who is struggling, a child who has lost their way, or anyone who has ever had to love somebody from a distance, because getting close would only hurt them more. Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read them. And if you haven't already subscribed to Alpha Dad Stories, so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'll see you in the next one.